Hi everyone! So in this video I'm going to be showing you my latest project, which is this really glamorous cape that I have some really specifically placed lace on the back, because this cape is actually secretly a giant manta ray. So if you're interested in seeing how I put this together, then go ahead and keep on watching. Alright, so the first thing I had to do was draft this pattern to see if it was even possible. I had the idea for this and I thought in my head it would work out, but sometimes things work out in your head that don't work out in real life. So I took this extra white flat sheet that I got from Walmart and I used this as my mock-up material. So what I did was I laid it out nice and kind of flat, then I laid down and decided that my arm span would be a good arbitrary width for this. So I took a Sharpie and marked my wingspan onto this fabric. And then once I had that marked, I should have been smart and done this, exactly on center, but sometimes when you're doing things at 3 in the morning, things don't really work out that way. So I folded this to make the two marks meet, luckily on very white sheets. Dark Sharpie will show through, and then I folded everything in half so that no matter what I did, I would have a nice symmetrical manta shape. So the next thing I did was went to Google and found some images of a manta ray. I needed the silhouette. So I had a couple ideas and I figured if I did it right, I might be able to cut this out as one giant piece and be able to kind of turn the... So in a manta ray, the little horn things are called cephalic lobes. So I thought I might be able to kind of first make this happen with that as one giant piece. And this is how I tried to cut it out the first time. So I have half of a manta ray drawn out. So now I'm going ahead and cutting that out. And this is going to be my first little test to see if this is a viable project. So here I am, and since I folded this in half, now I have a perfectly symmetrical manta ray outline. And it looks like it's gonna work. So at this point, what I did was took it to my mirror and tried it on just to see if this project would even work, and I noticed a couple things right away. So the first thing I noticed was that I had a lot of extra fabric kind of up at the top, and I didn't have a whole lot of room to move my arms. So all in all, it looked like this project was going to work out, so I just made a couple little alterations. The main thing was at the collar, so this is where I kind of realized that I wouldn't be able to cut it out all as one piece, and I was going to have the little horns have to come out as a separate piece. So I took a Sharpie, and in order to make some more room so I can move my arms around, I just drew a line from my shoulder all the way down to the end, and my plan was to cut that and spread that in a slash and spread kind of way to add more things. And then I also took that Sharpie and drew a quick line where the extra folder kind of at where the collar would be, where all that extra fabric folded and just didn't look nice. So here I am slashing and spreading, and I realized a couple of seconds after this that I should have waited until I had this on the second piece of fabric that I was going to use my second mock-up, because now when I move this over as a template to cut things out again, I'm going to have to remember the distance that everything was, because you see me sketching out the new shape of the manta ray. So I grabbed my trusty yardstick, went ahead and measured the amount that I had spread this in the slash and spread method, and I didn't get it 100% the perfect amount because this is as much fabric as I had left, but it was close enough. I was only off by about an inch or two. So now, using that first mock-up as a pattern for the second one, I just kind of eyeballed following a nice little curve to make everything fit. So I cut everything out, and this fabric I didn't fold, or the way that I had to fold it to make everything fit, the center back seam had to be on this seam, so I had to sew that up real quick. Alright, so now that I had my second mock-up, I took this back to the mirror and I noticed things were fitting much better. I was pinning this and crossing it in the front because at this point I had intended to do some sort of front closures. I was thinking of doing some bound buttonholes in the front at this point in time. Wound up not doing that, but that's okay. So also at this point, I was just checking to make sure everything fit the way I wanted it to, and I noticed I wanted to change just the tiniest little bit around the neckline. It was still a little bit coming up too high on my neck, but everything other than that was fitting just fine. I had the perfect amount of room left over to be able to move my arms, so I'm super happy with it. Now at this point in time, I just kind of cut myself a kind of like a placeholder cephalic lobe. Again, that's a little horn thingies, and I just sewed that on real quick. I tried to sew it on from shoulder seam to shoulder seam so that it would be nice and attached. I didn't spend a whole lot of time mocking that part up because I was pretty confident that I would be able to just kind of freehand it at that time. So again, here I am securing it in front and trying it on, and I'm really happy with how it turned out, and I'm even happier that this is now a fully viable project and something that is very doable. So another thing I did was I marked some shoulder darts. I wanted to have some nice darts in the shoulders. My shoulders slope a lot, so just kind of draping things over them doesn't always work. Things will slide off. So if I put some nice shoulder darts, everything would fit a little bit nicer. So I kind of folded them and just marked them as best as I could on both of my shoulders. One of them turned out much better than the other, so I marked the good one with a smiley face. So if you see a smiley face somewhere on my pattern, that is what that is. So the next step, now that I had a mock-up and a pattern that worked out, was to measure everything to make sure that I would buy enough fabric. So I just laid it out flat and took my trusty yardstick and did some quick measuring. And I only measured the big part of it because I knew that the little cephalic lobes would be able to get cut out of whatever was left. So I showed you my measurements, and so I wound up buying, I believe I bought 2 yards of, yeah, I bought 2 yards of my outer fabric, which is a 100% polyester. It's just black and it's heavy and it's coating, and it worked for me. And I wound up buying 3 yards of my lining fabric, which is a gray flannel, because it was a little bit narrower. So after taking apart my mock-up and unpicking everything, I went ahead and laid that out on my nice fabric. So I did pin it to the polyester on the outer layer because that kind of shifted around a little bit. And I tried to fold this. I tried my best to only have to cut out one section of it. That didn't quite work out. So when I got to the flannel, I was able to fold it in half and cut out both sections at once. But for the outer layer, I did not, so I had to be careful to remember to flip the pattern when I cut it out the second time, even though there really wasn't a front or a back of this fabric, but you know, good practice. Anyway, so here you see me cutting out the cephalic lobe or the collar piece. I'll call it the collar piece, that's easier to say. And I just kind of eyeballed where I wanted it to be. So after I cut it out, I marked with a pencil where these little lines that I made were, and these lines are where they meet the shoulder seams, so I would sew them. And I decided I wanted these to match up with the shoulder darts because that was right at the shoulder. I didn't really have any particular rhyme or reason for picking to do this the way that I did, other than it just seemed like it would work. So then I used that gray piece to cut out the outer piece, and I wanted to double check and make sure that I cut it out of the lining first and tested everything on the lining first, so that in case I didn't like it, I would be able to still make some changes to that, and then it wouldn't really affect the final garment. So now I'm starting to sew. I did some test stitches to make sure I liked my tension and all my settings on some leftover flannel. Then I used that flannel as a leading piece for me to sew up the center back seam of the collar pieces, as well as the outer piece and the lining piece. So here you can see me doing that. I think I aimed to only do a 1/2 inch seam allowance, but I think it was closer to a 5/8 inch. Which really isn't that big of a deal, but as you just need to make sure that you're doing everything consistently. The next thing I did was press all of my seams open. Now I had to be careful when pressing this because the flannel is 100% cotton and can take a lot more heat than the polyester could, and I really wanted to make sure that I didn't accidentally melt the polyesters, so whenever I was moving back and forth, I had to turn the heat of my iron down, and I also used this pressing cloth to try to prevent iron shine. At this point in time, I wasn't super worried about it because this was going to be the inside of the garment and any iron shine wouldn't show. I also pressed this open first by hand, and then I used the pressing cloth, and I went ahead and used this weight to help weigh down the seam to keep it nice and flat. Probably shouldn't have used a reusable battery pack, but you know. So the next thing I did was go ahead and do the shoulder darts. Now, the shoulder darts were a bit of a weird shape. They're not super triangular, so I did have to manipulate the fabric a little bit. So I did this first on the lining layer to double check and make sure that I liked how everything sat, so that in case I had to rip out the stitches and fix things, I could do it on that layer and not on the outer layer. So if I made a mistake, it would be hidden in the lining and no one would really see it. So I sewed up everything and tried it on in the mirror real quick, and I liked how everything sat, so I went ahead and just copied everything over to the outer layer and went ahead and did exactly the same thing. Also, with the lining layer, it's important to make sure that you remember that the nice side of the lining is going to be on the top and the visible side, so you're trying everything on the proper side. It's a little bit hard to explain, but hopefully you saw what I did there. So again, now that I had the lining all fixed the way I wanted it to, I just copied everything over exactly the same way onto the outer fabric and sewed up those darts. So now that the darts are sewn, I went ahead and I pressed these in different directions based on the piece. So on the lining piece, I pressed both of the darts toward the I have it written down, toward the center front of the garment, and on the main piece I pressed everything towards the center back. And the reason that I did that was to kind of prevent excess bulk from occurring at that seam point, because that's a seam point where the darts are going to be stacked on top of each other, and that's where the collar will also be set. So I wanted to make sure that there wasn't too much bulk there. So I noticed there was just not... The top wasn't smooth because of those darts, because I didn't cut everything with the darts out. So I just kind of trimmed off just the top, and I trimmed from the dart to the center of the lining. Then I folded it over to make sure that I got it symmetrical. And then once I had the lining cut, I just took that lining piece and put it right on top of the outer piece and just cut right along that. So this guaranteed me that I had even cuts, and I was taking the same amount of fabric away from both pieces of fabric. So I decided I wanted to sew up the front to the back all as one, mostly just out of laziness, and because without instructions telling me explicitly how to do it, I'm not really good at attaching collars. So I went ahead and, starting from the center back, I pinned right sides together the collar of the lining to the actual lining, and I backstitched at the shoulder seams and then just sewed all the way across to the other shoulder seam. Alright, with that sewn on, the next thing I did was, again, took it to the mirror, took a quick look at it, made sure that I liked how it came up. I liked the point where the collar detached from the cape, poncho, shawl. Anyway, so I attached the collar to the front section the exact same way, and now I'm attaching the front to the back. So I'm only going around the top edge and around the collar pieces, so I have those pinned together. And when I get to the collar piece, I'm going to do my best to kind of round out that curve and come back and not worry about detaching and back stitching. Ultimately, the reason that I did this like this was laziness, and because I don't have that much experience with collars, and I also wanted everything to be finished really nicely from the outside. So once I had everything sewn together and I went around with, I think, a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance-ish. Anyway, so at this point I went ahead and I clipped all of my curves, and I made the mistake and I did not clip the curves at the collar points where everything matched up, and you can see it because it doesn't turn out completely nicely, and I should have thought of that, but I didn't, and I'm not sure why, but at least my cephalic lobes are nice and round and smooth. I also went ahead along the length of the cape and clipped in some of the corner pieces on the outside just to help them turn out pretty nicely. So then I turned the whole thing right side out. I used a chopstick all along every part of the seam, not just the ones that were a little tricky, just to make sure that I had everything nice and flat and turned the right way out. So I pressed this from the flannel side, because that's the side that can take a little bit more heat, also to prevent iron shine, which I was doing research on for a completely unrelated project right before I started this, and I'm like, that's why sometimes things get shiny when I iron them. So here I am pressing that nice and flat, and at this point I didn't really want to do any sort of finishing stitching. I didn't really think it was going to be necessary, and I really didn't want there to be a whole lot of visible top stitching. Later I did decide to understitch the lining to get it to turn nicely and to stay on the inside of the garment, but at this point I was really hoping that just pressing it would be enough. So now I once again took it to the mirror, did a quick little try on, and I'm really happy with how it's going so far. I am pleasantly surprised that this is working out as well as it is. And this whole thing went surprisingly well. That's the whole theme of this entire project. So I'm looking at it, I'm making sure that I like the fit of everything, and at this point is when I'm kind of starting to decide maybe I don't want to close it up in the front. Again, mostly because of laziness, because I didn't want to have to deal with hand finishing bound buttonholes, even though these would be significantly easier than all the other ones I've done because they would be much bigger. Anyway, I decided against it, also mostly because flannel will stick and I didn't have to worry about it. So now I came over to decorating, and I have this lovely lace. I have about 1 yard of it. I found it in remnants, and I decided to cut appliques out of this and use this to decorate the back. Now for this manta ray, I am designing this off of a specific manta ray who lives at Georgia Aquarium. Her name is Nandi. So she is the only manta ray over there that has this beautiful white saddle on her back. That's what they call it. And manta rays have unique saddle kind of patterns. That's how people in the wild and researchers in the wild can identify them from each other. And since I was previously an intern at Georgia Aquarium, and I did not work in Ocean Voyager, which is the big exhibit where the manta rays are, I do have some really good memories surrounding the mantas and surrounding Nandi, and I would be wearing this to an event over at Georgia Aquarium, so I thought that would be most appropriate. So I cut out a bunch of appliques. I wound up needing more, and I found it was so hard to find a top-down picture of Nandi, but I finally found one in a video and I took a screenshot of it. So I'm picking through all of these lace appliques, and I cut them kind of big this time around. Normally I cut them smaller, but I cut them pretty big, and I'm just going through and arranging them, trying to mimic the shape of her saddle, both kind of at her where her shoulders would be and down where her hips would be. And I settled on a couple of different variations of this, and this is the final design that I eventually settled on. So now, once I had everything laid out and settled on, you'll see my reference image right over there. I pinned everything in place and then started the long process of tacking everything down by hand. Now, luckily for this particular lace, which, again, not before I went to the mirror and tried it on to make sure I liked how everything sat. This part was actually important to go look in the mirror at, because when you're laying things out on 2D and then you take it over to a 3D surface like a body, sometimes it doesn't always line up perfectly and it doesn't work exactly the same way you thought it would. So it's important to try it on for that. But for this lace in particular, it was made up of long white stitches. So I was able to very easily make big stitches and blend them into the lace very easily with white thread. So that did make my job a little bit easier. I could take much bigger stitches and not have to take super tiny little invisible tacking stitches. And I did this at this point because I learned from the last time I sewed on a bunch of lace appliques was I wanted the threads of the lace to be hidden within the lining and to not be visible from the outside because I didn't want to accidentally catch the threads on anything. So this is why I did this at this stage, and I didn't, wait till the end and have everything lined up and all that good stuff. I also wanted to do this at this point in time because I knew the lace would add weight to the garment, and I wanted to let the bias settle because part of this, since it is so huge in the way that I had to cut it, part of this did have to get sewn onto the bias. So I wanted to make sure all of that was weighed down properly the way that it would be before I finally hung it up to let it settle before I attached the lining. Doing this along the top was a little bit more difficult and a little bit hard to get to, and sometimes in pinning I would accidentally pin things between both layers of fabric because I wanted to make sure I pinned it in the right spot, and I didn't want the fabric shifting around too much, so it was a little difficult. Basically, if you're going to do something like this, kind of start from the outside and work your way inward. I like to keep my hand between the outer layer and the lining just to make sure I didn't accidentally sew through both of them. So now I have everything hung up, and for hemming this, I originally was thinking I was going to have to do this kind of the long and difficult way by hand, which is, I procrastinated this for a couple of days just so I didn't have to do it. But right before I did it, I realized that I had a lot of curves in this, and just the fabric wasn't folding right. If I were to just turn it under and turn both sides under, and kind of stitch them together by hand. So I figured doing this the lazy way may actually be a lot better because then I could clip the curves and help them turn right side out. So this is where I decided to go ahead and do my understitching. So I didn't pin this, I just took it to my machine and just understitched it. For the most part, I trusted myself to be able to just sew a pretty straight line and feel and all of that. Normally, I would advise against that because if there's a way to make something go wrong, I always find a way to do it, but this worked out surprisingly well. Again, that was the whole theme of this project. Everything worked out surprisingly well. Was it good luck, or am I actually becoming a decent seamstress? Who knows? So at this point, the collar was still kind of open, like you could reach your hand in there and fuss around with things if you needed to. I originally intended to just leave it as it is and then fold everything under and then hand stitch that down, but then I thought, you know what, why not? Let's try something real quick. So I painstakingly, very carefully folded everything over to attach the collar section from the front to the inside. I don't really know the right words to describe what I'm doing, but hopefully you can see what I'm doing. And I was very careful with this, and I only caught like just the tiniest little amount of fabric that wasn't even worth going back and ripping out and fixing. So again, this went surprisingly better than expected. And when you're doing weird stuff that you're not sure if it's going to work out, just go slow, take your time, don't rush through it. Because when you rush through it, that's usually when you make your mistakes, or at least that's when I make my mistakes. So once I got through there, it was smooth sailing all the way to the other tip of the wing. I'm not entirely sure why I left in all of this footage of me sewing. I assume most of you at this point know how a sewing machine works, but, never assume. I guess think my life is way more interesting than it actually is. Also, I'm getting better about clipping my threads, go me. So now that I have everything nice and arranged, and I realize now that doing the understitching kind of makes things sit not properly and not the way that they should. Anyway, so now at this point I matched up the lining to the outer layer. The lining did distort a little bit, but it's also a little bit of a looser weave than the outer fabric was. So I just went along and pinned it. It didn't quite work out. There was more lining fabric than there was outer fabric, so I did have to wind up putting in a really subtle dart on the inside of one side, and I decided to leave that kind of extra fabric open on the other side so that I would be able to turn the garment right side out. I also realized at this point that flat lining it, or doing it flat on the table, was maybe not the best idea, because I did have, again, this is a 2D thing that will be hanging on a 3D body. So I took all the pins out and hung it up and did it again from the outside, because sometimes when you attach fabric to each other, that's two different lengths, but if one is on the outside of the other, you can make it work and it'll line up. It's one of those things that if you don't sew, then I'm so sorry that you have no idea what I'm talking about, but if you do sew, then you hopefully understand. I also realized after I did this that I probably should have done this from the outside, because again, the lining will be on the inside of the garment when it's worn, and it won't be on the outside, so that's, again, more lining fabric getting kind of tied up on the outside than will actually be there. So when I did finish this, I do have a little bit of, it's a little bit baggy in that the lining does kind of pull away from the outer layer a little bit. It's nothing too crazy, but if I wanted to do this and make this actually like super high fashion and make this properly, that is something that I would have wanted to fix. And I don't know whenever I would want to make a second manta ray cape, but if I did, now I know better. So now that I have everything sewn, I am going ahead and clipping through my seams. Don't use pinking shears like I did, because I accidentally clipped through the thread on the very first clip that I did. But I fixed it with some freight check and prayers. So I'm going through and clipping all of my seams, which is the reason that I decided to do this by machine and not by hand, so that all of the curves would turn nicely. I know there's a way to do like concaves and convex versus when you're just clipping straight lines and clipping triangles, and it's a lot. Anyway, after that I pinked all of the edges to kind of take away all of that excess bulk and to prevent things from fraying. And I also learned that a chom chom, which if you have a pet that has hair and don't own a chom chom yet, get one. A chom chom is also really good at picking up really tiny pieces of like lint scraps from my ironing board. I also clipped the points of the wings to be able to turn them out nice and sharp. So now I'm turning the whole thing right side out. Side note, don't have rings on your fingers when you do this. I got caught on the prongs of my one of my rings. The only ring that I had at that time. Ho ho ho. But I went ahead and took my trusty chopstick and turned my points out really nice and sharp, and I also took it and kind of pressed it along the entire seam just to make sure that I had all of the seams pressed out and that I didn't have any fabric kind of caught in between when I eventually went to go press this. Again, hope I'm making sense. This is one of those moments where I tell myself that for the next video I'm gonna write an actual like proper script to my voiceover, and then I never actually do. Next step is to iron. And once I have that pressed, I didn't show you because I hope at this point you know what ironing looks like. I did go ahead and whip stitch that opening that I used to turn everything right side out shut. I sewed through all layers of the lining, but I only sewed through that part of the outer fabric that got turned in, so the seam allowance of that, and this was so I didn't have to worry about any visible stitching on the outside of the cape. And you can see here, this is that fold that I had to make in the fabric to kind of make everything work and fit nicely, because the lining wound up being a lot bigger than the outer layer. You know what, I'm gonna start just roasting myself whenever I leave in excessive amounts of footage that you don't need. Like, do you really need to sit there and watch me sew this entire thing up? No, you don't. Why do I think my life is that important? Like, you all have much more important things to do with your time. Or maybe you just like to have me on in the background while you're sewing, because I also like to watch other people's sewing videos in the background while I'm sewing. Sometimes I pay attention, sometimes I don't. So here I am tying off that thread and then burying the threads. That is a relatively new thing that I'm doing. So now what I'm doing is figuring out the closure on the collar piece. So I am crossing them in the front where I would like them to lay, and then I am taking 2 pins and marking where the other one crosses. I hope that makes sense. So now I am taking it and wrapping it around my sleeve board to have a nice elevated surface. And now what I am doing is crossing them, and then I am marking the exact center of where those crosses are, and that is where I am going to put my snap. Now I am using a snap closure for this because I might not always have enough tension on it to make a hook and eye work. So I sewed a snap-on, and it's a very large snap. And unfortunately I did have to go all the way through all of the layers. I tried to make it as neat as I could on the outside. Satisfying sound. Oh yeah. At this point I decided I was going to put some sort of beading or brooch on it, but I never actually got around to it. So here is the final cape, and I'm really happy with it. A little bit of room for improvement that I'm going to talk about in a minute, but I'm so happy with it. Honestly, I prefer to wear this with like the cephalic lobe kind of crossed. It makes it lay a little bit nicer than when they're all nice and tucked into each other. I just kind of forgot when I chose a snap closure that snaps are circular and can rotate all the way around. But you know, you live and you learn. So this is the final cape. I am very happy with how it came out. I apologize if you hear my boyfriend snoring in the background. He has work early tomorrow, but this is how everything came out. I'm very happy with it. There's a little bit of room for improvement, a couple little things that I could do. Like up here I had a little brooch with a drop pearl on it that I tried to get on here, but because of the snap underneath, it's really hard to manipulate the fabric to kind of push it in there and actually get a brooch on here. So eventually I'd like to get something nice to sew down up here. I also would eventually like to get some more white lace, or cut out some more white lace and go ahead and do the like the pattern on her wings. I think that would just add something a little bit nice, but I also very much like just how it is right now, with just the lace on the back and the decor on the back. I eventually opted not to add any sort of closure to this because flannel it's kind of sticky, like it stays where you put it, and I didn't really have to worry too much about it sliding off or falling off throughout the night. And I wore it for the entire night, and it didn't go anywhere. It just stayed right where I put it, and it was great, and I loved it, and it's very warm. And I was worried that it was going to be too hot because of this outer polyester layer, but it wound up being just about perfect. So I'm really excited going into the colder season, and I have this really nice cape that's looks nice and it's easy to put on, and I have the little marine biologist secret that it's actually a giant manta ray. So I am super happy with it. I might eventually consider adding on some more snaps to the front, or maybe some hooks and eyes or something. Again, I don't really need it, but you know, options. So also this cape is super special to me because this cape opened up an opportunity for a big secret project that I'm going to be working on and off for the next 3 years or so. So if I ever disappear from YouTube for an extended amount of time, or if I have some blankets or things thrown over things in the background so you can't see, there's a very large secret project that I will be working on for the next 3 years. So yes, that is very exciting for me. Anyway, I hope you like this video. Thank you so much for watching and joining me on this marine biology meets high fashion kind of thing that I wanted to go on. I've had the idea for this cape for so long, like months, maybe even years, and I'm just so happy that I actually had the time to sit down and actually make it, and it turned out even better than expected. So thank you so much for following along with me, and if you are interested in behind the scenes and live updates, go ahead and give me a follow on Instagram over at Thread and Needlefish. Over there I was going ahead and putting little sneak peeks and letting people kind of try to guess to what I was making. Thank you so much for watching, and yeah, I'll see you in the next one. Bye!